March 12, 1994. The night had fallen heavily over the small inland town. One of those nights when the wind roams the streets, as if carrying secrets that no one dares to utter. The silence was almost absolute. Only the creaking of old windows, poorly shut, broke the quietude from time to time, mingling with the distant rustling of the abandoned wheat field. The streetlights were scarce, some already burned out, plunging the alleys into even denser shadows. It was a common scene, but marked by a rule that hung over everyone. Never look at the sky after midnight. No one knew where this prohibition came from. Maybe from stories told by grandparents who swore they had seen things they dared not describe. Maybe it was just superstition, created to keep the children indoors. But the fact is, no one, there was no police to watch, no law written on paper, no official punishment. Even so, everyone obeyed. It was as if fear was part of the very air they breathed in that town. With each generation, the warning was passed down with the same seriousness as a will, and no one challenged it. The empty streets reflected this silent pact. At midnight, all the curtains were drawn, the doors locked. The dogs, which roamed aimlessly during the day, disappeared as if they too understood the invisible agreement. The vast and forgotten wheat field on the outskirts became forbidden territory. No one dared cross it after the fateful hour. They said it was there that the sky weighed heavier, that the darkness became densest, that the eyes of the firmament opened to look back, and no one wanted to be there when that happened. But that night, something broke the tradition. Clara, a young woman with a restless spirit, didn't believe in love. She had grown up hearing those stories, but to her, they were just echoes of a superstitious past. There was nothing in the sky but stars, nothing beyond what science had already explained. So, when she pedaled her bicycle back home a little after midnight, she didn't hesitate to cut through the forbidden field. The cold wind beat against her face, the pedals spun quickly under her feet, and the waning moon lightly illuminated the outlines of the swaying wheel. She didn't realize at first that she had crossed the invisible boundary that everyone avoided. She only noticed the different weight of the air when she was already in the middle of the field. The wind, constant before, seemed to stop suddenly. The wheat leaves ceased their movement, frozen in an unnatural stillness. Even the distant sound of crickets fell silent, as if the world had held its breath. Clara stopped pedaling. She stood, still holding the handlebars, looking around. A shiver ran down her spine. That quietude wasn't normal, but there was something more. A faint glow began to form above her, timid at first, but growing with each second. It was different from ordinary stars, as it pulsed in tones that shifted subtly, like breaths of light. Clara's heart raced, and for the first time in a long time, she felt real fear. It wasn't fear of thieves or accident. It was an ancestral fear, seeming to rise from the earth's depths and climb up her throat to suffocate. That glow wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a plane, not a meteor. It wasn't anything she could explain. The words of the town echoed in her mind. Never look at the sky after midnight. In that instant, she understood why that phrase had been repeated for generations, but it was too late. She had looked, and from that moment on, her life would never be the same. Clara continued through the field with her bicycle, trying not to give in to the tightness in her chest that grew with every meter. The air seemed heavier, as if it had turned liquid, making breathing difficult. The bicycle's weak headlight illuminated only a few steps ahead, but now even the beam seemed unable to pierce the dense darkness enveloping her. The silence was so absolute that she could hear her own heart beating in her temple. The sensation was of crossing a forbidden place, a space where time no longer obeyed the same rules. The bicycle chain snapped. Clara stopped, adjusted her breathing, and without realizing it, raised her eyes. That's when she saw it. In the sky, above the wheat field, there was a cluster of lights descending in slow, fluid movement, as if obeying a rhythm that wasn't human. They were different from any plane or helicopter. They didn't blink, didn't make noise, just pulsed in shades of blue, green, and violet, colors that blended like living waves. It wasn't technology. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was something that breathed, something that looked back. The handlebars slipped from her hands. The bicycle toppled onto the wheat, but Clara remained motionless. Her eyes were locked on it. Every fiber of her body screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. The field lit up little by little, bathed in the soft reflection of the lights descending in slow circle. The sensation was that the whole world was watching, but in silence. Even the wind had stopped, and the night seemed to hold the air in anticipation. Clara took a few hesitant steps. The wheat grains brushed against her legs, but she barely noticed. The sky's glow dominated everything. That's when she noticed something even more impossible. Figures moved among the wheat, not far from her. Tall, slimmer than any human, They walked in steps that made no noise, as if floating over the ground. Clara's heart pounded, and for a moment she thought she would faint. But she stayed. Her eyes met theirs. There was no monstrosity in their faces, just difference. Eyes larger than human proportions would allow, deep and silent, seeming to carry entire galaxies within. Their bodies were long, translucent in some point, as if not made solely of flesh, but of something beyond. The most unsettling thing, however, wasn't the appearance. It was the way they looked at her, without haste, without aggression, like observing a curious animal that had suddenly crossed an unexpected boundary. Clara felt her knees buckle. She thought of running back to the bicycle, but she knew it wouldn't help. They had already seen her, and even if she managed to escape, something told her that look would be etched in her mind forever. It wasn't just fear. It was the sensation that, in that instant, there was no more distance between her and what came from the sky. They were in her space, and she in theirs. One of them advanced a little more, a few meters away. Clara took a step back, but didn't scream. The silence was so dense that her own breathing sounded too loud. The being tilted its head, as if studying each of her gestures. No sudden movements, no threat, just observation. Clara trembled, but couldn't look away. It was as if she were trapped in a silent exchange that didn't depend on words, just presence. The lights in the sky pulsed stronger, illuminating the field in unreal tones. The more distant houses in the town remained dark, but Clara knew that behind the closed curtain, someone might have noticed the different glow. Still, no one would dare open a window. The rule was clear: never look after midnight. Maybe others had seen something similar before, but preferred to stay silent to not carry the memory. Now, however, there was no turning back for her. The encounter was happening, and each second seemed to expand into eternity. Clara realized she wasn't breathing. She tried to inhale deeply, but the air seemed stuck, dense, as if she were inside invisible water. Fear tightened her throat, but there was something more, a strange calm coming from those beings' gaze. They weren't soldiers, not predators. They were different, and that very difference was more frightening than any attack, because there was no way to predict what they would do next. It was in that instant that Clara understood. She had crossed the boundary that the whole town avoided, and now what separated her from that wasn't a closed street or a locked gate, but just a few meters of wheat illuminated by colors that didn't belong to this world. Before we continue, if this video is being useful to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment. This helps us bring more stories like this one. And then, the unexpected happened. Clara and those figures exchanged the first silent look that seemed deeper than any conversation. There were no words, but there was something in the atmosphere that communicated: a warning, a presence, a judgment. Time seemed to have stopped. If this story has held your attention so far, imagine what's still to come. So, comment below. Would you have run or stayed still before them? I want to read your response, because every reaction reveals a lot about how we face the unknown. Clara remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the figures advancing slowly through the wheat. Her short breaths seemed to echo louder than they should, as if each inhalation were a denunciation of her presence. But there was no more hiding. The entire field was bathed in the strange luminescence of the lights, and she was the only human point there. For an instant, she thought of kneeling, as if surrendering to something much greater. But there were no weapons, no signs of hostility, just silence. A silence so absolute it was becoming unbearable. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the pocket of her jacket, searching for any gesture that would make her feel she still had some control over the situation. That's when she found something banal: a pack of mint candies, bought hours earlier at the corner store. It was ridiculous, but it was what occurred to her. Instead of fleeing or screaming, Clara raised her hand, showing the small package. The gesture was slow, almost hesitant, but sincere. The nearest being tilted its head to the side, like observing a curious and incomprehensible creature. It took a step forward, stopped before her, and for an instant, Clara believed her heart couldn't take it. Time suspended, the night cold mixed with the heat rising from her body. Then, in almost solemn fashion, the alien extended one of its long, thin hands, lightly touching the package. Clara let go. The object fell into its palm, as if that gesture were the most natural thing in the world. The being stood still, studying it. No words. Just a translucent gaze that seemed to penetrate beyond her skin. Then, slowly, it opened the wrapper. It took a candy, observed it as if it were a relic from another universe, and brought it to its mouth. The field grew even more silent, if that was possible. Clara felt each second as an eternity, until, suddenly, something changed. The being's eyes lit up in colors that didn't exist in the human palette, as if reflections of entire nebulae had ignited in its iris. It remained motionless for a few seconds, and then something impossible happened. It smiled. It wasn't a human smile, but a subtle stretching of features that conveyed something close to joy. And from that gesture came a strange sound, metallic, guttural at first, but quickly transforming into something recognizable. A laugh, first low, hesitant, but soon echoing across the entire field, as if the lights themselves responded to the vibration. Clara looked around and realized the others were laughing too. It wasn't mockery, not a threat. It was genuine. The young woman brought her hand to her face, not knowing if she was laughing along or crying. Those beings who could have been monsters from nightmares were laughing because of a simple mint candy. The scene was too absurd to be real. And yet, it was. The contrast was so intense it frightened her even more. The impossible was becoming familiar, and that seemed dangerous. But there was something more. A subtle presence invaded her mind, like a voiceless voice. It wasn't language as she knew it, but thoughts that formed on their own inside her. You shouldn't be here. Clara almost lost her breath. She looked around, but no mouth was moving, no sound at all. It was telepathy. That message hadn't been spoken. It had been imprinted in her consciousness. She took a step back, but another sensation came, as if the same voice tried to correct. But since you are... Don't fear. Her heart was pounding, but the strange peace in the words kept her from collapsing. She realized the communication wasn't clear. No long sentences, just impressions, fragments of meaning, but enough for her to understand. They weren't there to destroy. Not at that moment. Still, it wasn't possible to relax. Clara knew she was facing something that escaped any human logic. One wrong move, and everything could be lost. That's why she held the remaining candies in the crumpled package firmly and offered them again, with a trembling movement, almost childlike. Another of the beings approached. Its skin seemed made of solid mist, and its eyes carried the depth of dark ocean. It took a candy, brought it to its mouth, and after a moment of silence, also smiled. The laugh echoed in harmony with the others, as if they were discovering something extraordinary in human banality. Clara couldn't help it. She laughed too. A nervous, trembling laugh, but real. For a moment, the barrier of fear broke. There was no abduction, no screams, no violence, just an unlikely exchange. Humanity offering a common sweet, and the cosmos responding with laughs that seemed to vibrate beyond sound. She felt tears streaming down, not from terror, from shock. The contrast was overwhelming. The world had taught her to fear the unknown, to imagine destruction when looking up. But there it was, before her, the opposite. It wasn't terror, it was curiosity. It was almost friendship. And yet, even amid the laughter, the voice returned to invade her mind. You shouldn't be here. But this time the tone wasn't accusation. It was statement, as if her very presence in that field were an anomaly, a break in something greater. Clara didn't know if she should feel privileged or marked. The laughter faded, until only the glow of the lights over the wheat remained. The beings continued looking at her, and now their gestures were gentler, almost imitative. One of them tried to cross its legs and sat down, like a child copying a human gesture. Another brought a hand to its face, reproducing the way Clara had done seconds before. They learned, imitated, repeated. It wasn't a display of power. It was curiosity, fascination. Clara breathed deeply. She felt vulnerable, but also part of something impossible to deny. An ordinary young woman with a pack of candies in her pocket, turning an encounter that could have been the end into a bridge. An absurd, unlikely bridge, but real. And in that instant, as the stars seemed to shine closer than ever, Clara realized that fear had given way to something else. Not full trust, but mutual recognition. She was no longer alone in the field, and they, for the first time, perhaps weren't either. The metallic laughter of the beings faded until it disappeared completely, dissolving into the wind that began to blow again, but irregularly, as if each gust obeyed a strange rhythm. Clara remained there, motionless, her eyes fixed on that group of figures that now observed her in absolute silence. Suddenly, the lights suspended in the sky began to pulse stronger. The blue became intense, the green exploded in short flashes, and the violet opened concentric circles that spread across the field. It was as if space itself contracted and expanded in regular intervals, generating invisible waves that made the ground tremble. The first impact was subtle. The earth vibrated as if something underground moved. Then came the deep, almost deafening sound, which didn't seem to come from above, but from the planet's very core. The houses in the town, still asleep, creaked in their ancient structures. Windows shuddered, doors trembled in their hinges, and the dogs began to howl in desperation, as if sensing what humans wouldn't dare face. The midnight silence was broken by a collective murmur. Behind closed curtains, families awoke, but none dared go out. Clara, however, had no choice. She was in the center of the field, illuminated by beams of light descending in circular movements, as if surrounding her. Her eyes burned, not from the brightness, but from the weight those lights carried. They weren't just luminous beams, they were gazes. The beam vibrated on her skin, as if probing every fiber, every pulse. She felt exposed, analyzed, almost dissected by something that didn't need to open her body to understand it. The alien figures stayed around her but didn't approach anymore. They observed, attentive, as if Clara had become the true point of interest. The empty candy pack now lay on the ground, forgotten, but to them it seemed irrelevant. What mattered was her. Clara knew that. It wasn't just a casual encounter. There was something in her presence that had attracted unexpected attention. On the other side of the town, some windows opened discreetly. Human eyes tried, even against their own fear, to understand what was happening, but few dared to look for more than a few seconds. The intense glow seemed to invade the mind, penetrate thought, and etch memories one didn't want to carry. So, most quickly closed the curtains, preferring to believe nothing was there. Still, everyone felt the tremor. The ground holding their houses had vibrated as if the earth's heart had beaten out of rhythm. Clara remained firm, even with her body trembling. There was nowhere to run. Every step toward the field seemed watched, every gesture measured by eyes that didn't blink. The fear was still there, but now accompanied by a strange responsibility. It was as if, unwillingly, she had become the representative of all those hidden behind the curtain. Those beings looked at her, not because she was special, but because she was the only one available, the only one who dared cross the boundary. The light beams began to move in more complex patterns. Perfect circles were traced over the wheat, burning its surface in marks that would remain there long after that night. Clara saw the ground glow under her, forming geometric designs that expanded as if obeying a visual language, a code impossible to decipher. The aliens didn't speak, but their gestures turned to her, as if expecting her to decipher it. Clara felt a wave of heat rise through her body. Her mind was overtaken by a low hum, a sound that didn't come from her ears, but from inside her skull. It was as if someone were trying to tune her mind to another frequency. She fell to her knees, pressing her hands to her temples, but there was no pain, just overload of information. Fragmented images surged, dark seas from another planet, cities suspended in light, deserts with no horizon, and behind it all, the sensation of emptiness, a cosmic void so vast it almost swallowed her. When she opened her eyes, Clara realized the entire field was vibrating in sync with her body. The wheat bent in waves, accompanying the light's pulse. It was as if the whole universe had concentrated there, over her, over that ordinary young woman who was just heading home on her bicycle. The beings took a few steps closer. There was no haste, no threat, just curiosity. Clara felt she was being studied, not like an animal trapped in a lab, but like something rare that wasn't expected to be found. It was humanity in its simplest form, vulnerable, scared, but willing not to retreat. On the other side of the field, Clara noticed shadows. Some townsfolk had gathered at the edge of the wheat, unable to resist the spectacle. They watched from afar, but didn't dare approach. Their faces were filled with a mix of fascination and terror. None screamed, none called for help. They all knew instinctively they were facing something that would never be explained, and perhaps never should be. The whole town seemed contained in that invisible boundary between the field and the houses. Clara was alone in the center, but not isolated. Every pair of eyes behind the windows, every held breath, every hesitant step to the edge of the wheat, everything converged on her. She had become the link, the point of contact, the focus of the night everyone avoided. And yet, there was no absolute terror. The fear was real, yes, but there was another layer, mutual curiosity. Clara feared what they might do, but those beings also watched her with the same unease. It wasn't hate, nor conquest. It was fascination. The universe might be theirs, but for some reason, they were more impressed with a young woman on a bicycle and a pack of candies than with the stars they dominated. The light beams intensified, spinning in ever closer circle. Clara raised her head and breathed deeply. She knew she was on the brink of something no one would ever believe. And in that instant, she understood. What happened from then on wouldn't just be an encounter. It would be a mark. a line etched between the before and after of humanity. The field was covered in circles of light that expanded and contracted, like breaths of the night itself. Clara, still kneeling, felt her skin burn under the probing beam. But something had changed. The initial terror had given way to a strange, almost reckless courage. Perhaps because she had already accepted there was nowhere to run. Perhaps because, on some level, she understood those beings weren't there to destroy her. The aliens approached more. Clara noticed their movements had become less solemn, almost clumsy, as if trying to imitate something. One of them bent its knees and sat on the ground, copying the way she had fallen to her knees moments before. Another brought a hand to its face, reproducing the gesture she had made holding her temple. It was like watching curious children, fascinated with new behaviors. The contrast was surreal. Creatures that seemed to carry galaxies in their gaze, repeating banal human gestures as if they were scientific discoveries. Clara, feeling her heart race, risked more. She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, and took 2 steps forward. The beings didn't retreat. On the contrary, they followed her movements with hypnotic attention. Then, without knowing exactly why, Clara laughed, a short, nervous laugh, but sincere. And in response, she heard that metallic sound she had heard before, their laughter. Now, however, it sounded more natural, closer, as if the entire field had entered a strange rhythm of echoes and responses. She sat on the ground, crossing her legs. The aliens, in perfect sync, did the same. The wheat around swayed with the movement, as if complicit in the moment. Clara extended her hands, showing she had nothing but herself to offer. The beings just watched, tilting their heads slightly, repeating the gesture in almost comic fashion. The fear dissolved into something new, complicity. Suddenly one of them stood and walked toward her. Clara felt her muscles lock, but she didn't move. The being stopped a few centimeters away, so close she could see impossible reflections swirling in its eyes. Then, slowly, it raised one of its long, translucent hands and touched hers. The cold of the contact was immediate, but not the chill of something dead. It was the coldness of living metal, of energy that didn't belong to Earth. In the instant their fingers met, Clara was overtaken by a wave of images, galaxies crumbling in silence, stars being born in explosions of light, barren worlds without horizon, oceans of liquid crystal, entire civilizations rising and vanishing in seconds. It was as if millions of memories that weren't hers crossed her mind at once. Clara gasped, feeling she might faint. But amid that cosmic chaos, a single phrase echoed in her mind, not in Portuguese, nor in any human language. It was pure thought, a vibration that turned into meaning. "You are enough," the phrase repeated, clear, vivid, as if etched into her soul. It wasn't a threat, not a judgment. It was recognition. Not like evaluating an inferior species, but like finding something unexpected and accepting it as it is. Clara couldn't hold back the tears. The weight of those words was greater than anything she had ever felt. All of humanity seemed condensed there, in that unlikely validation. She looked around and saw the other aliens also motionless, as if sharing the same thought. Their eyes glowed in intense colors, and the wheat around vibrated with silent force. Clara didn't know if she was witnessing a ritual, an experiment, or a revelation. She only knew that after those words, nothing in the world would ever be the same. The being slowly withdrew its hand. Clara fell to her knees again, without strength to hold herself up. But there was no pain, just an immense void followed by a strange peace, as if she had been filled with a secret she could never explain to anyone. The entire field seemed to pulse. The townsfolk at the edge of the wheat, watching from afar, felt the ground tremble stronger. Some retreated in panic, others stayed, fascinated. But all, even without hearing the phrase, knew something had happened. A boundary had been crossed. Clara, still on her knees, raised her gaze to the sky. The light spun faster now, creating spirals of energy that lit the horizon like dawn before its time. Her breathing was rapid, but her eyes were steady. She had understood. It wasn't destruction, nor salvation. It was a seal, an invisible mark that humanity had been noticed and accepted. The wind returned to blow violently, spreading the wheat in wide waves. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the cold air cut her skin. She mentally repeated the phrase she had heard, trying to etch it into every cell of her body. "You are enough." Those words weren't just for her. They were for everyone, for those who believed and those who would never believe. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed the aliens still watching her, but now without the previous solemn distance. There was closeness. They were sitting, some leaning to the side as if resting, others repeating human gestures in almost playful ways. Clara laughed softly, incredulous, seeing one of them try to lie on its side in the wheat, imitating her in an almost childlike manner. The impossible had become intimate, the unknown had become close. And yet, even in that unlikely atmosphere of calm, Clara knew she was on the edge. Any movement of the lights, any new word, could change everything again. But in that instant, only one certainty mattered. Something had broken forever. The barrier between the human and the incomprehensible had been breached. Clara was no longer just a young woman on a bicycle. She was a witness to a recognition that would forever change the way she saw the world. The lights in the sky began to move away in slow, almost solemn movements, as if obeying an invisible ritual. There was no haste, no sound of engines or energy explosion, just the silent displacement of something that could never be mistaken for human technology. The beams that had surrounded her dimmed, retracting like waves returning to the sea. Clara, still kneeling, watched with tear-filled eyes, unable to distinguish if she cried from relief, exhaustion, or the emptiness that opened when it all came to an end. The wind returned to run through the field, this time naturally, swaying the wheat in disordered waves. The dawn chill made itself present again, reminding Clara that she was alive, that she still had a human body bound to Earth's laws. The beings, one by one, began to fade into the darkness preceding dawn. There was no farewell, no final gesture, just a charged silence, as if nothing more was needed. In the center of the field, the crumpled, empty candy pack remained on the ground. Clara looked at it like a relic. That was all that was left of an impossible night. A banal object turned into a bridge between worlds. She approached, picked it up with trembling hands, and put it in her pocket. She knew no one would believe her, but for her, that piece of plastic was silent proof that she hadn't gone mad. The first houses in the town began to show signs of movement. Doors opened, some people stepped into the streets, drawn by the light marks that still glowed faintly on the horizon. In the field, perfect circles burned into the wheat stretched for dozens of meters, visible evidence that something had been there. Some approached cautiously, others watched from afar, but all carried on their faces the same mix of fascination and fear. No one dared speak loudly. Whatever was said would be insufficient. Clara remained still, breathing deeply, trying to control the tremor in her body. She didn't know if she should tell what she had seen, or if it would be better to keep the secret to herself. The phrase still echoed in her mind, clear, impossible to forget. You are enough. It was as if those words had been etched into her skin, running through her veins, weighing on every heartbeat. That morning, the town was no longer the same. For some, it would all be just another superstition fed by marks in the wheat. For others, confirmation of a fear carried since childhood. But deep down, everyone knew something had happened, something no simple explanation could erase. Clara returned home with slow steps, her body still trembling, her face pale. She walked the streets as if in a dream, hearing murmurs behind the curtain, hidden gazes following her. But she responded to nothing. She kept within her a certainty that couldn't be divided into words. That March night, there was no abduction, no war, no technological revelation. What there was deeper, an encounter, a recognition, and a message too simple to seem grand, but heavy enough to change the course of an entire life. Clara was never the same again. And even when the town tried to convince itself that nothing had happened, she knew the words would be inside her forever. You are enough. The field returned to silence, but nothing there was the same. Clara carried with her a phrase she could never prove, but that would transform her way of existing. You are enough. Perhaps what connects worlds isn't science nor power, but simple gestures, like laughter or a mint candy offered at the right moment. Since that night, the town lived between doubt and certainty, but Clara knew they had seen humanity and accepted it. If you had lived that night, what would you have done? Run, cried in fear, or stayed to offer something simple, like Clara did? Write in the comments your reaction, because maybe the next encounter is with you.